The sun spilled gold across the marble driveway as Margaret Hale stepped out of her grand villa, the morning air still crisp. A leather handbag hung from her arm, her phone pressed to her ear as she laughed softly with a friend about the upcoming charity luncheon. From the side service door, Lucia Morales appeared, but not with her usual calm grace. Her face was pale, eyes wide with a fear Margaret had never seen before. "Your husband cut the brakes. Don't start," she screamed, her voice cracking in panic. Margaret froze mid-step. The polished black Bentley sat gleaming in the sunlight, its chrome trim winking like it had secrets to hide. The keys dangled loosely from her fingers, her mind caught between disbelief and a cold rush of dread. For a heartbeat, the world went silent, and everything hinged on what she would do next. From the outside, the Hales had the kind of life people clipped from magazines and pinned to vision boards. Their countryside estate sat on 10 acres of manicured gardens, each hedge sculpted into elegant curves. A fountain in the shape of a swan stood at the center of the circular driveway, water glistening like crystal under the morning sun. 3 luxury cars, a Bentley, a silver Mercedes and a deep blue Aston Martin, were lined up in the garage, each spotless as if they'd just rolled off the showroom floor. Margaret Hale, in her early 40s, was the face of refinement. Known for her charity work, she was a familiar presence at fundraisers, galas and art auctions. Her name appeared often in society columns, always accompanied by a flattering photograph and words like elegant and poised. When she walked into a room, she carried herself as though the air itself adjusted to make space for her. Her husband, Charles Hale, mid-40s, had a reputation as a brilliant businessman. His charm was effortless, a handshake that felt personal, a smile that seemed warm enough to melt walls. In public, he was the perfect partner, attentive, courteous, the kind of man who'd place a hand on the small of his wife's back as they moved through a crowd. Together they looked like the embodiment of success. But doors have a way of keeping secrets. Behind closed walls, the warmth cooled. Conversations between Margaret and Charles grew shorter, often replaced with polite nods over dinner instead of laughter. Charles's late nights at the office became routine, and when he was home, there was a detachment in his gaze, as if he were present in body but far away in thought. Sometimes Margaret would glance up from her book to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part calculation. Then there was Lucia Morales, their maid for the past 5 years. In her mid-30s, she had left her home country to build a life here. Quiet and efficient, she moved through the house like a shadow, never intrusive but always aware. She noticed things others missed: a glass left half empty, a jacket draped hastily over a chair, the faint scent of motor oil clinging to Charles's cufflinks. For the public, the Hales' marriage was a perfect picture. For those who lived within these walls, it was a painting with hairline cracks, the kind that only reveal themselves if you look closely enough. Lucia had been in service long enough to know when something in a household shifted. It wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it was the absence of things, the missing laughter in the dining room, the vanished warmth between two people. For weeks now, Charles had been different. It began with the late nights. At first he claimed it was work. Important clients, meetings that ran long, deals that demanded his attention. But Lucia noticed that instead of heading straight to his home office when he returned, he often went into the garage. She'd hear the faint hum of a light under the closed door and the occasional metallic clink of tools. Then came the phone calls, always in hushed tones, his back to the room, one hand gripping the counter as if steadying himself. Whenever Lucia entered unexpectedly, the conversation would cut short, and he'd slip the phone into his pocket. Margaret, for her part, seemed distracted. She'd ask casual questions about Charles's schedule but never pressed too hard. If there was tension, she smoothed it over with the same grace she brought to charity events. But even Lucia noticed the change in her employer's voice, just a fraction cooler, a little slower when speaking to her husband. And Charles, he had become quick to snap. Small things, a missing pen from his desk, a slightly overcooked egg, now sparked irritation. Margaret usually brushed it off, but sometimes Lucia saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was slipped into the regular mail, folded in half, no return address. The handwriting was careful, almost too neat. "Be careful who you trust." Margaret read it at the kitchen counter, eyebrows lifting only slightly. "Probably from some bored social rival," she said with a soft laugh. "You know how people in these circles get when they have nothing better to do." She tossed it into the bin without another thought. 2 more letters followed in the weeks after. The words were different but carried the same vague warning. Margaret reacted the same way each time, a light chuckle, a shake of her head. To her they were petty attempts at drama. To Lucia they felt like something else. Then there was the garage incident. It was late evening, the house quiet. Lucia had gone to fetch a box of cleaning supplies from the storage shelf. As she stepped inside, her foot slid on something slick. She caught herself on the wall and looked down to see a small pool of oil glistening under the overhead light. Before she could move, Charles appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was sharp, almost accusing. I came for the supplies," she said, pointing to the shelf. His gaze followed her finger, then drifted back to her face. "Be careful," he said slowly. "And don't poke around in here. Some things aren't your concern." Lucia nodded, murmured an apology and left. But the warning clung to her like a shadow. Something was happening in this house, something she couldn't name yet. The signs were there, scattered like puzzle pieces. She just didn't know what picture they would form. The first to notice the change in Margaret wasn't Charles, and it wasn't Lucia. It was Evelyn Hart, her oldest friend. They were having tea in the sunroom one afternoon, the early light streaming through the tall windows. Margaret sat opposite Evelyn, stirring her cup with slow, distracted motions. Her hair was perfect as always, her dress crisp, but there was something in her eyes, a faint heaviness that no makeup could cover. "You look tired," Evelyn said gently, studying her friend's face. "Is everything all right?" Margaret smiled, that well-practiced, society-ready smile. "Just busy. Too many events, too little time." Evelyn tilted her head. "Margaret, you've looked after everyone else for years. Maybe it's time to let someone look after you." Margaret laughed softly and changed the subject, but the comment lingered long after Evelyn left. A few days later, Margaret found herself thinking back to a recent charity gala. The ballroom had been awash in gold light, chandeliers dripping crystal over silk-covered tables. Margaret had been making her rounds, thanking donors and mingling with guests, when she noticed Charles across the room. He was standing close to a young woman in a fitted emerald gown, his hand resting casually, too casually, on the back of her chair. He leaned in as he spoke, his smile easy, his gaze locked on hers in a way Margaret hadn't seen directed at her in a long time. She'd felt the heat rise to her cheeks. When Charles noticed her watching, he didn't look guilty. He simply offered a small, unreadable smile before returning to the conversation. It was 2 nights later that Lucia heard the phone call. She had gone to the laundry room to fold freshly dried linens when she heard Charles's voice, low, urgent, coming from the study with the door half closed. "She won't see it coming," he said. "Pause. Make it quick." Lucia froze, clutching the stack of towels. The voice on the other end was too muffled to understand, but Charles's next words made her pulse quicken. "I don't care how. Just make sure it's done." She stepped back quietly, heart thudding. Whatever he was talking about, it wasn't business as usual. The next morning, Margaret mentioned casually over breakfast that her Bentley was due for servicing later in the week. Charles, spreading marmalade on toast, shook his head. "No need. I had them cancel it," he said. "Everything's fine with the car." Margaret frowned slightly. "I don't recall you handling the car appointments." He smiled thinly. "Just trying to make life easier for you. Besides, you've got that meeting in the city tomorrow. Better to drive yourself than wait for the driver." Lucia, clearing plates from the table, caught the smallest flicker in Margaret's eyes, surprise, maybe unease, before she smoothed her expression. That afternoon, Lucia went to the garage under the pretense of dusting. The Bentley gleamed as always, but something caught her eye, faint smudges under the driver's side, not from her cleaning cloth. She crouched down and saw them clearly, fresh fingerprints pressed into the metal, close to where the brake line ran. Her gaze lifted to the workbench in the corner. A rag sat crumpled there, dark with grease. And on top of it, one of Charles's cufflinks. Lucia's stomach tightened. She'd pressed those cufflinks herself just days ago. They had been spotless. That evening, Margaret announced her plans for the next morning. "Evelyn and I have a fundraising meeting in the city. I'll probably leave around 8. Charles was pouring himself a drink in the study. "You should leave earlier," he said without looking up. "Beat the traffic. Take the Bentley, it'll be more comfortable." Margaret hesitated in the doorway. "I was thinking of taking the Mercedes." He finally looked at her, smiling as if the decision was trivial. "No, take the Bentley. Trust me." Lucia, dusting the shelves nearby, felt her breath catch. She couldn't shake the image of those fingerprints under the car. She couldn't shake the memory of Charles's voice saying "make it quick." Margaret nodded eventually, but there was a stiffness in her shoulders as she turned away. Lucia knew she had to decide soon. Speak up and risk her job, maybe her safety, or stay silent and risk something far worse. The house was still, wrapped in that heavy late-night quiet where every sound seemed sharper. Lucia had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind looping over the day's unease, Charles's sudden insistence that Margaret take the Bentley, the fingerprints under the car, the grease on the cufflink. Sleep was impossible. Finally, she decided to get up and fetch a glass of water. She padded softly through the dark hallway, her slippers making almost no sound against the hardwood. As she passed the kitchen, she froze. There was a faint light bleeding from under the door that led to the garage. She crept closer, stopping just short of the doorway. Through the thin wood, Charles's voice reached her, low, deliberate. By the time anyone finds her, it'll be too late. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. A pause, then his voice again, colder this time. No loose ends. The words weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. Their weight landed heavy, even muffled. Lucia's fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe. Every instinct told her to walk away, to pretend she'd heard nothing. But her curiosity and something deeper rooted her there. There was the sound of movement, footsteps crossing the concrete floor, and then the creak of the garage door opening. She darted back into the shadow of the pantry just as Charles stepped into the kitchen. He carried a faint smell of oil and metal with him. He didn't notice her. Without turning on any lights, he went straight upstairs. Lucia stood frozen for a moment, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then she moved. The garage light was still on, casting sharp shadows across the floor. The Bentley gleamed under the harsh bulb. She knelt beside the driver's side, her hands trembling slightly. The metal was cool under her fingers as she traced her way toward where the brake line should be. Then she saw it. The line wasn't whole, it had been sliced almost clean through. A slow, dark drip of brake fluid fell to the concrete, leaving small, sinister stains that spread like ink. Lucia's stomach turned. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't an accident. She rose quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, her mind racing. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. She leaned against the cool wall of the garage, trying to steady her breathing. If she went to Charles, he could deny everything. Worse, he might see her as a threat. If she went straight to Margaret, would she even be believed? In 5 years of service, she'd seen how the wealthy handled uncomfortable truths. Margaret was kind, yes, but she had her blind spots, especially when it came to her husband. Charles was charming, persuasive. It wouldn't take much for him to spin the story and make Lucia the villain. And if she misstepped, there was more at risk than her job. Those words, too late, no loose ends, rang in her ears. She imagined tomorrow morning, Margaret in her elegant coat, slipping behind the wheel, starting the car, driving toward the city, and then nothing but twisted metal on the side of the road. The image made her chest tighten. Lucia pressed her palms against her face, forcing herself to think. She had to act, but carefully. If she said nothing and something happened, she'd never forgive herself. If she said something and it backfired, she could be silenced in more ways than one. Upstairs, the floor creaked faintly as Charles moved around. The sound brought her back to herself. She switched off the garage light, closed the door quietly, and padded back toward her room. Tomorrow would bring choices. Dangerous ones. She didn't yet know how she'd do it, but she knew one thing with certainty. She had to find a way to keep Margaret out of that Bentley. Lucia barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the brake fluid dripping onto the cold garage floor. Each slow drop sounded in her head like a clock ticking toward disaster. When dawn broke, she rose before the alarm, moving through her small room in silence. Her hands shook as she buttoned her uniform. Today was the day Charles had insisted Margaret take the Bentley. She paused outside her door and listened. Somewhere downstairs, the faint melody of humming floated up, a tune Margaret often sang while preparing breakfast. The sound should have been comforting. Instead, it made Lucia's chest tighten. She descended the staircase, her steps careful, and entered the kitchen. Margaret stood by the counter in a tailored cream coat, her hair perfectly set, a silk scarf draped around her neck. She was spooning sugar into her tea, her handbag already waiting by the door. "Morning, Lucia," she said warmly. "It's going to be a busy day. I'll be back late." Lucia hesitated, then forced her voice steady. "Ma'am, perhaps you should take the Mercedes today. Just in case." Margaret chuckled, lifting the cup to her lips. "Why on earth would I do that? The Bentley's far more comfortable for city driving." Lucia's fingers curled into her apron. "Still, I just think it might be safer." Margaret's eyes softened with amusement. "Lucia, I promise I'll be fine. You worry too much." She moved toward the door, humming again. Lucia followed, her heart pounding harder with every step. Margaret reached for the Bentley's keys from the small tray in the foyer and stepped into the crisp morning air. The black car gleamed at the end of the driveway, sunlight catching on its polished hood. Lucia's chest constricted. The image of that sliced brake line burned behind her eyes. She could see the future in flashes, the city streets, a sudden bend, no response from the brakes. Something in her snapped. She bolted forward, her voice cracking with urgency. "Your husband cut the brakes. Don't start." The words tore through the quiet morning like glass shattering. Margaret stopped dead, her fingers tightening around the keys. She turned slowly, confusion flickering across her face, followed quickly by disbelief. "Lucia, what did you just say?" Before she could answer, a familiar voice came from behind them. "What's going on here?" Charles stood in the doorway of the villa, his expression one of perfect concern. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt crisp as if he'd just come from a morning meeting. Lucia's stomach nodded. His tone was calm, almost soothing, the kind of voice that could convince anyone he was the reasonable one. Margaret glanced between them, her brow furrowed. "Lucia seems to think." But Lucia cut in, her voice firm despite the fear twisting inside her. "I know the brakes were tampered with, ma'am. I saw them." Charles's eyebrows rose in mock surprise, his lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Really? That's quite an accusation." The driveway air felt heavy, the tension balanced on a knife's edge. Margaret's gaze shifted between her husband and her maid, caught between loyalty and a creeping sense that something was very, very wrong. Margaret's voice was sharper than Lucia had ever heard it. "Charles, is this true? Did you touch my car?" Charles stepped forward with a sigh, placing a hand over his heart as if wounded by the suggestion. "Darling, really? This is absurd. She's making wild accusations, probably to gain your sympathy or stir up trouble. You've been too soft with the staff. It was only a matter of time before one of them tried something like this." Lucia's spine stiffened. "I'm not lying. Please, ma'am, come see for yourself." Charles gave a low chuckle, shaking his head as if humoring a child. "Margaret, don't let her drag you into this nonsense." But Margaret didn't move back toward the house. Instead, she walked slowly toward the Bentley, her heels clicking against the driveway. Lucia followed closely, her pulse quickening. Charles trailed behind, his smile growing thinner. Lucia crouched beside the front driver's wheel and pointed. "Look. Right there." Margaret leaned down. A thin, steady drip of dark fluid fell to the concrete. The metallic smell of brake fluid hung faintly in the air. Charles exhaled, almost laughing. "Oh, for God's sake. That's probably just a leak. Cars develop them all the time. I'll take care of it after your meeting." Margaret straightened slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Why would I take a car with a brake leak into the city?" Before Charles could answer, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the tense silence. A navy sedan pulled into the driveway. Evelyn stepped out, sunglasses in hand, her expression curious. "I thought I'd pick you up for the meeting," she said cheerfully until she saw their faces. "What's going on?" Lucia seized the moment. "Mrs. Hart, the Bentley's brakes have been cut." She caught herself, glancing at Margaret. "Someone tampered with them." Evelyn's head whipped toward Charles. "Is this true?" Charles gave a polished shrug. "Of course not. They're both overreacting." But Evelyn wasn't convinced. She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Ben. He's worked on my cars for years. If there's a problem, he'll tell us." Within 15 minutes, a pickup truck rolled up. Ben, a grizzled mechanic with grease permanently embedded in his hands, crouched by the Bentley. He didn't need long. When he stood, his expression was grim. This wasn't wear and tear. This line was cut clean. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Evelyn's gaze snapped back to Charles. "Care to explain that?" For the first time, Charles's polished exterior cracked. The charming smirk faltered, replaced by something colder. "You all act like she's perfect," he spat, jerking his head toward Margaret. "Like I'm supposed to just watch her throw my money away on charity and parading around like a saint while I rot in the background." Margaret's face went pale. "So you thought you'd what? Kill me?" His eyes flashed with something between rage and satisfaction. "You wouldn't listen. You never listen. You think you're untouchable, Margaret, but you're not." Lucia stepped instinctively in front of her employer. "You won't hurt her." Charles's lips curled into a snarl. "Stay out of this, you little." But Evelyn was already dialing. "Police. Now." Charles started to speak again, but the distant wail of sirens cut through the morning air. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up, officers stepping out with practiced calm. Margaret stood still as one officer guided Charles toward the cruiser, reciting his rights. He didn't resist, but as he was led away, he glanced over his shoulder. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low but sharp enough for all of them to hear. Lucia's hand trembled slightly, but she kept her eyes locked on him until the car doors closed and the police drove away. The driveway was quiet again except for the steady drip from the Bentley, the last trace of what could have been. Margaret exhaled shakily and turned to Lucia. "You saved my life." Lucia didn't answer right away. She just nodded, the weight of what had almost happened settling into her bones. Evelyn's arm slipped around Margaret's shoulders. "Come on. Let's get you inside." As the three women walked toward the house, the tension began to ebb, replaced by the dawning realization that for the first time in weeks, the danger was truly gone. 3 weeks later, the Hale estate glowed with soft golden light spilling from the tall windows. Guests mingled in the grand dining hall, dressed in elegant evening wear, champagne flutes catching the glint of the chandeliers. Margaret stood at the head of the room, wearing a deep navy gown that gave her a quiet authority. Tonight was her first public appearance since the arrest, and the reason was close to her heart: a charity dinner honoring unsung heroes. The chatter quieted as she stepped to the microphone. "Tonight," she began, her voice steady, "we recognize courage that doesn't wear a uniform, doesn't hold a title, and doesn't seek the spotlight. We honor those who see the truth even when others look away." She turned toward the side of the stage. "Lucia Morales, will you please join me?" The applause was warm, genuine. Lucia stepped forward hesitantly, her black dress simple but elegant. She looked out at the sea of faces, donors, dignitaries, society figures, people she had spent years serving from the shadows. Now they were all looking at her. Margaret held up a small glass award. "For bravery, loyalty, and quick action that saved a life." "Thank you." Lucia accepted the award, her voice quiet but sure as she spoke into the microphone. "I only did what anyone should do. I saw something wrong and I couldn't stay silent." The room erupted into applause once more. Evelyn, standing near the front, clapped the loudest. Later, after the last guest had left and the staff had cleared the tables, Margaret and Lucia stepped out into the garden. The night air was cool, scented faintly with jasmine from the trellises. They sat at the wrought iron table where Margaret often had her morning tea. Tonight she poured 2 cups herself. "For years," Margaret said softly, staring into the steam, "I thought I could read people. I thought I knew who to trust." She looked up at Lucia, her expression warm but tinged with regret. "You reminded me that loyalty isn't about where someone stands in life, it's about where they stand when it matters." Lucia smiled faintly. "And sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the ones who see the clearest." A silence settled between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who had been through something together and come out the other side changed but stronger. Margaret glanced toward the darkened garage in the distance, the Bentley now locked away and awaiting repairs. "It still frightens me," she admitted, "how close I came to never seeing another sunrise." Lucia's hand rested briefly on Margaret's. "That's why we drink tea in gardens," she said gently. "To remember what we still have." Margaret gave a small laugh, her eyes shining. "To gardens then." They lifted their cups, the quiet clink of porcelain marking a moment neither would forget, a moment not of victory but of survival, trust, and the kind of friendship born from fire. The screen fades to the image of Margaret and Lucia in the garden, the warm glow of the house behind them. Margaret's voice comes in softly, almost like a thought shared only with the viewer. "Sometimes the smallest voice is the one that saves you. Listen." The shot lingers for a moment, the steam from their tea curling into the night air, before slowly fading to black. White text appears on screen. "Would you have believed Lucia?" A pause, then another line. "Comment your thoughts and share this story with someone you trust." As gentle music swells, the final prompt appears in bold. Subscribe for more true life stories that inspire and warn. The video closes on a soft chime, leaving viewers with the weight of the moral and the lingering image of 2 women bound by a moment of courage that changed everything.